Can I just ask if anybody's actually hearing anything at the moment?
I can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Ah, brilliant. I've got some sound now. Hi.
Toby said to me that he probably wouldn't be able to make it for the beginning of the session, or maybe not at all. So maybe should we just wait another minute or two and then kick off?
Yeah, I mean, it's 2 minutes past now, Ben, and it's being recorded, so possibly
Fine.
You might as well just go for it, I think.
Okay, I will do that. In which case, good morning, and it's very nice to see you. Hello. I thought it might be quite interesting for us to talk a little bit about what it's like when you meet an orchestra for the first time as a guest conductor, because it's, well, certainly in my experience, it was one of the things that felt quite disarming when you first start working with professional orchestras, is how different it can feel from, well, in my case, what I'd been used to, which was working with my own orchestra in London, which began as a sort of, student-y orchestra and gradually became a professional orchestra. But because it's something that I run was always very much under my control, so I knew exactly what it would be like. But it was very, very different from, the student orchestras, sort of university and college orchestras, and the amateur orchestras that I'd worked with, just because the vibe, the atmosphere is so completely different. Please, at any moment, just feel free to chip in with questions or things to add, because it should really be a sort of a discussion more than anything. One of the things that I think is really, really important to remember is that different professional orchestras are very different from each other. So if you like, project orchestras where they just meet occasionally rather than full-time orchestras, has a feeling it can be much more like an amateur orchestra where, I don't know, at the beginning of this year, I was in Heidelberg with the Heidelberg Sinfonica, and the management, it's almost like a kind of cooperative. All the management roles are divided amongst players. So everybody who runs the orchestra is also playing in the orchestra. When I arrived, the double basses, one of whom is the managing director, they were kind of setting up chairs and music stands. It was really, really, really informal. Everyone kind of hugs and all this kind of stuff, and there's lots of chat and haven't seen you since November and how's everything. And it has a really kind of informal feeling. Whereas you contrast that with, I don't know, an orchestra, one of the BBC orchestras or something, and someone will take you from your dressing room to the stage where everything's just set up and there are 90 people waiting for you, and that is a really, really different feeling. It's also really important to remember with full-time orchestras that they do this essentially all day, every day. And the hopes that you have going in as a conductor and wanting to make a good impression won't necessarily tie up with how they happen to be feeling that day. And it's, I think, really, really important always just to bear in mind that if an orchestra is looking a bit bored or a bit tired, or as if their hearts aren't really in it, it might have something to do with you. And of course, you should always do everything that you can to inspire them and to make it fun and to be efficient and productive. But I've had orchestra managers or managing directors or the leader or someone apologize to me before the start of a project, before the start of a rehearsal, and say, look, I'm really sorry, we're just shattered. We had a concert in wherever last night and the coach got back at 2 a.m. and, or this is the end of a really long season for us. Always happens at Christmas. This is the end of the orchestra's been working back just maybe, you know, an early finish might be appreciated. There are all these sorts of things that don't have anything to do with you. And I think anything that you can do to try not to take those things personally, you know, very often, I'm sure you've all experienced this at the end of a rehearsal where, you know, with a student orchestra or an amateur orchestra, or, you know, even a professional orchestra, you know, you have a really nice rehearsal and you thank them and, you know, say you've had a really nice day and see them tomorrow or something, and there's a little round of applause. I would always thank an orchestra at the end of a rehearsal, at the end of a day of rehearsals. But, you know, sometimes an orchestra, they go, meh, and then they just leave and they just all switch their phones on. And it's like someone leaving an office. And I think very often at the beginning of my, you know, sort of going around and starting to meet some of these orchestras, I could find that quite a little bit brutal, because you sort of feel as if you want people to come up to you and say, oh, you know, and talk to you about the music and enthuse, because, you know, you perhaps have spent, you know, weeks or months or more than a year preparing for something that might be a really, really big thing in your really big moment in your career, but for them is literally just another day in the office. All of which is not to say that it's not you know, it's still important. And also the other thing to bear in mind is that, one of the many things, I think, especially as young conductors, there is often, I feel, a lot of pressure, or we think there's a lot of pressure to sort of finish rehearsals early. You know, if you've got a day of rehearsals, finish an hour early and everyone will love you, and, you know, and then you'll be invited back. But actually, that, in my experience, is not necessarily the case. There are some orchestras that just would like to leave as early as possible, but in general, the overriding experience I've had are that really they just actually want to get it right, and they want to work hard and they want to be worked hard, but it's essentially just about the conductor using the time efficiently. The most frustrating thing, I mean, I'm sure you've all experienced it watching conductors rehearsing, is someone who doesn't know what they want. And I think if you can explain to an orchestra why you're repeating something, what the purpose is, they'll kind of go to the ends of the earth for you. But if you just repeat something, they can feel as if their lives are slowly ebbing away, and they're not sure why they're being asked to repeat something. Usually at the beginning of a project, you'll be introduced by someone, whether it's, you know, the managing director of the orchestra or the orchestra manager, or, you know, or even the leader of the orchestra. I usually find that's a really bad time to suddenly realize that the stand is a foot too high or a foot too low, or that, you know, your score doesn't fit. Or so what I always try to do is get to the hall quite early. If I don't know the hall, if I've not been before, I don't know the orchestra, get there quite early and actually go into the hall. And the other thing then that enables you to do is go, oh, okay, the double basses are there, and okay, the timpani's there, and where's, okay, the first oboes, you know, just actually kind of absorb the layout. Because I've also arrived at a hall, you know, from a plane or something, not late, but very, very on time, and you just sort of rush straight in and you start conducting, and you suddenly realize that actually the horns are on the other side, and it's very, very disarming. So I always feel getting there quite early to sort of familiarize yourself with the hall and actually just make sure that you're happy with the setup on stage is time really, really well spent. Of course, you can then go away and have a coffee or whatever it is you do beforehand. Another sort of gentle piece of advice, maybe when you don't know the orchestra or they don't know you, is actually not to come out too early. It's, again, a sort of slightly weird feeling if you come into a hall, you know, 10 minutes before whatever the time of the rehearsal is. And of course you don't know anyone. And although you may yourself be feeling a little bit nervous, you know, some orchestras are very, very friendly and people will come and say hello. But in some orchestras, they're just getting on with it and they'll chat to each other, but they won't necessarily come and chat to you. And so you might just find yourself sitting in the hall on your own for 10 minutes, and the person who might come and introduce you might arrive at 59 and a half past or whatever. So I always go to the hall early, get myself set up, leave the scores there, go away, and then come back at 58 or 59. When I was in St. Petersburg last May, I did exactly that. And I was sitting in my dressing room, drinking a cup of delicious sort of Russian tea, and the concertmaster came and knocked on my door, and he said, "Maestro, we are ready." And it was 56 minutes past or 57 minutes past, and I've never experienced anything like it in my life. And it was the most terrifying thing, that an orchestra would be ready 3 or 4 minutes and want to start rehearsing. And so I came out and I was sort of introduced, and then they tuned. That's the other thing. Don't forget to let them tune. It's so easy because you're sort of keen to get going. Actually, just especially if there's an announcement, to sort of forget that they need to tune. And they tuned, and I looked at my watch and I said to the leader, "Should we start?" And he says, "We are ready." So that was, I think, the only time in my life that the orchestra has come to get me, because they were ready early. If you're in a country and the orchestra doesn't speak your mother tongue, it's really worth just learning. If you don't speak their language, just learning enough things to say good morning, thank you, coffee, very good. You know, my mum was a French and Russian teacher, and she taught me like five bits of Russian. So I can say, you know, hello, good morning, you know, hello, thank you, my name is, what's your name, how are you, very good, cup of tea, and I love you. And this basically got me through a week in St. Petersburg, because every time you get to a break, you say a cup of tea, and they all laugh once they worked out what it is you're trying to say. And I mean, I don't speak any Portuguese, but when I did something with an orchestra in Portugal, I managed to say good morning in Portuguese, and then, you know, rehearsed in English. And I apologized to the concertmaster for speaking English in the break, and he said, "You say good morning in Portuguese, you win the orchestra." And I think that's, especially for the British conductors amongst us, in this slightly difficult time politically, let's say, it's a really good time. It's a really good thing to show that you are stepping as far towards the orchestra as possible, and being respectful of them. And of course, if you speak their language, all the better. It really doesn't matter, using a mixture of you know, your language, their language, Italian, German, singing, whistling, anything that you can think of to get across what you want. But just a few words in their language go a really long way. It's always worth finding out ahead of time exactly what the schedule is. Of course, usually you may have been involved in planning that, but particularly actually just working out when the breaks are, and when orchestras prefer to take their breaks. There are in some countries very strict rules. You know, it must be between an hour and a quarter and an hour and 30 minutes, but you know, you can't do an hour and 30 minutes and 10 seconds. You have to stop exactly at that time. Sometimes there'll be a big clock on the wall. Sometimes there'll be a little clock by the leader's stand in front of you. It's usually worth making sure that whatever you're using to tell the time is synchronized with that, because I've had, you know, 30 seconds more on my watch, and the leader of the halle looks down and says, "We've got to stop." And you say, "Oh, okay, sorry." And if that ever happens, if anybody from the orchestra ever says, "We need a break," you just instantly, you don't say, you just instantly take the break. It's never ever worth having any kind of dispute about that kind of thing. The famous story goes, I think it was Charles McHarris at the end of a rehearsal said, "Oh, you know, ladies and gentlemen, I've just got one more thing to say." And the orchestra manager said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, we need to stop." And he said, "It's literally just one more thing." And they said, "No, really sorry, you can't." And so they met back the next morning, and everybody's there at 10 o'clock. And he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday's rehearsal was really excellent. I'm cancelling this morning's session. See you at 2:30. Allegedly, I don't know. But yeah, so if you know when the orchestra needs to take its break, how long that break is, whether it's 15 minutes or 20 minutes, or in the case of a longer rehearsal, 25 minutes, or whether it's a 15-minute break and then 10 minutes later, all those sorts of things are really important to know. There can also be sometimes quite a lot of pressure particularly from brass and percussion players, to rehearse kind of large to small, and sometimes, you know, so the largest piece with everybody first, and then gradually work down to the smallest pieces. Usually that will have been decided in advance with management. When you do the schedule, sometimes they want to keep all the extras to one session and then rehearse with a smaller orchestra, well, either first or later. I prefer doing large to small because it gives you more possibilities. The worst thing is going small to large and realizing that the small stuff took less time than you thought. And then you're waiting for the trombones to arrive, so you have another break, or that's awkward to manage. But it can be really difficult when the trombone section kind of comes to petition you to say, you don't need us after lunch, do you? We've just got this one note in the thing. And actually how you deal with that is really important. If you say, no, I need you for the afternoon session, but then you make them sit there for 40 minutes before they play, they will hate you forever. If you say, look, I'm really sorry, I'll get to it as quickly as possible, but I do need you there, and you can get it done in the first 12 or 15 minutes, and then you say, trombones, thanks very much, see you tomorrow, then they'll appreciate it. Even if they have to stay for their lunch break, you know, they're paid to be there for the session. But very often, or sometimes, there will be pressure from players, and learning to cope with that is quite difficult. It's often good to talk to the orchestra manager about it and put those sorts of requests through them, so it's all sort of dealt with officially. I'm sure this is the same for all of you. When I meet an orchestra for the first time, I feel as if it's those first sort of 5-10 minutes on the podium that are the most crucial, if you like. I always try to conduct for as long as possible before I open my mouth. You know, so if it's a symphony, I might play through a whole movement, or even a whole symphony, before I really say anything apart from good morning. I think that's important for a number of reasons. The first reason is that actually an orchestra often will judge you principally by what you're able to convey to them without talking. And if you can start having a conversation with them on the podium without using any words, when you do start talking to them, what that first thing you say to them is slightly less important. I'm sure we've all had this experience in competitions or auditions where you think, oh God, I've got 12 minutes or something, and you're conducting, and then you stop and you think, oh shit, I've got to say something now. And that, you know, working out what to say can be a bit terrifying sometimes. And it can feel a little bit like that sometimes when you're meeting an orchestra. But I think conducting for a few minutes before you say anything is always a really, really good idea. The worst thing to do is to play 3 bars, stop and start rehearsing. That's really the most soul-destroying thing for an orchestra, because they feel that they're not being given a chance to get to know you. One of the other things that I'm very aware of, particularly now working a bit more in Germany, is that orchestras will play in a different place to your beat than perhaps you expect. And it will often take 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe an hour, you know, a little while for you to get used to where they play. And in my experience, it's better for the conductor to learn to deal with where the orchestra plays, rather than stopping and saying to the orchestra, oh, you're late. I always think of essentially the most difficult thing that I have to do is getting from the first beat to the second beat, because sometimes you put the first beat down and it feels like it takes so long for the sound to arrive that you're really scared to go to the second beat. And actually, this is again a thing that you'll find with orchestras, professional orchestras that play together all the time, is that if you start in a tempo that's slightly faster than the tempo they're expecting, if you wait for them, they'll play slower. But if you just carry on and are a bit ahead of them for a bar or two, they will catch up. Everything, they'll just somehow sort of rolls forward together. But if you stop and wait for them, you never get it back, and then you have to stop. And you'll very, very often see it, particularly with conductors who just give a one upbeat rather than a 3/4, or or a bar for nothing or something, you'll very often notice that the orchestra is a little bit behind them for the first bar or two, and then it sort of meet in bar 3 or so. When you're preparing to meet an orchestra and you have a lot of time and it's an important thing, I think it's good to, project in your mind to try and imagine what it's going to be like, and sort of imagine the sorts of things that might come up. And, of course, as always, we want to be prepared for the questions that we might be asked. But I think it's important never to come with preconceived ideas of what you think you'll have to rehearse, because it's always different. And orchestras know instantly when a conductor is wheeling out pre-planned rehearsal ideas rather than actually listening and reacting to what's happening in real time. I've found in the past, particularly when I sort of meet a big orchestra for the first time, that actually the first few minutes can be a little bit overwhelming just because it's such a huge sound. There are places where you suddenly realize that you can't hear the double basses, or the acoustic, you can see the woodwind players playing, but you can't hear them. And so I try as quickly as possible to sort of get over that sort of shock of that, and just start listening analytically and critically as quickly as possible. It's also really, really worth bearing in mind that usually if you're rehearsing in the orchestra's home or in a hall that they know very well, they know the space very, very, very much better than you do. And of course, you need to balance things, and you need to talk about making sure that various things can be heard. But with a really good orchestra, very often they know how to do those things. Maybe they need pushing to the extremes, but in general, it should always be borne in mind that standing on the conductor's podium is usually a pretty bad place for balance. The strings seem very, very powerful, and the wind and brass can seem very weak. But if you go into the hall 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 rows back, you often don't hear the strings very well, and the wind and brass just kind of come sailing over. So often just being willing to trust the orchestra, that they know what they're doing. I suppose the last thing I would really present to you is that the way I sort of look at it is that when you're a guest conductor, is that you shouldn't move the furniture around too much. You can go in and you can say, "Oh, what a beautiful room. Would it be all right if we just turned this chair a little bit like that?" Or, would you mind if we did just that picture's a little bit thing, we just straighten that. But it's difficult if you come in and say, "Right, I want this over here, that over there." And I mean, sometimes literally I have done that in already the orchestra feels like that, because I've asked to have, for instance, antiphonal violins. They're used to sitting first violin, second violin, fearless cellos, and I want first and seconds and cellos there and basses in a row at the back. All those sorts of things, it's worth, if you want to change the layout of an orchestra, it's worth considering if it's worth it in the amount of time you have. If you have just one rehearsal and a concert, it may not be worth it. If there's a piece that just absolutely demands it, like, I don't know, Enigma variations, where at the very end the sort of violins and violas and violins and cellos sort of are in antiphony, call and response, talking to each other, and it's absolutely essential, fine, go for it. But if it's just something that you prefer, but it's something the orchestra isn't used to, it can be quite a dangerous thing to do when you go and meet them, because if it's what Roger Norrington always says, the second violins who haven't had to polish the left-hand side of their shoes for the last 25 years. And second violins who are not used to sitting on the outside often hate it, because they feel exposed and they feel as if the sound's going the wrong way. And if you have 2 or 3 days to sort of coax some enjoyment out of them, that's great. But if you only have 3 hours, it's not usually enough time. And it can be very difficult then if the orchestra has already decided that, look, he's moved the furniture around, literally. Who does he think he is? there's an orchestra I work with sometimes in Germany, in Reutlingen, where they sit first, seconds, cellos, violas on the outside, which is a layout that for me does nothing at all. I just, I don't get anything out of it. I don't sort of see any logic in it, but it's how they choose to sit, and I just kind of embrace it and go, okay, that's my sort of guilty pleasure for this week. Because when they have to sit, actually the first project we did, the sound engineer insisted that they sat first, seconds, violas, cellos the sort of normal way, and they hated it because they were used to sitting another way. So yeah, general advice, just listen, be really polite, be really efficient, and don't move the furniture around. And I suppose also just to trust that, I think we all have this kind of imposter syndrome when it's something that's a big engagement for us. I certainly used to sort of worry that, what am I doing here? I'm, this feeling that you're going to be found out. But actually, if you're really prepared and you're polite and you're efficient, most orchestras are just lap that up and just get on with it. I think the not moving the furniture around thing is a useful thing to remember. I've heard other people talk about it as something like a cake. Just saying, oh, what a delicious cake. Would you mind if I just put some cherries here? Or, would you just, rather than picking up their cake and smashing it on the floor and saying, right, let's build a new cake. There are times when you need to do that with a particular element of what's happening. You need to just completely rebuild something. That's fine. But orchestras, particularly orchestras who play together a lot, full-time orchestras, are proud of what they offer you. And it is wise to sort of take that gift that they're giving you and try to refine it and help it, but not to completely reject it and rebuild it in your own image. Right, I've talked far too much already. Please say things, ask questions. Just I don't know how we do this. Just feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you want.
Hello, Ben. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Hi, how are you?
Hi, good to see you. Very good, thank you. I had two questions, if that's okay. One of them was about devising a schedule with the orchestra, and he said, you get in touch with the manager, I guess, or whoever is taking care of it. And in your experience, is it mostly that they have a strong preference and you maybe ask them to tweak something if possible, or is it always a conversation about where you want this piece to be rehearsed, those people to be involved?
Yeah, it really depends on what sort of an orchestra it is. So let's say it's a kind of like one of the BBC orchestras and you're just doing a schedule that only requires members. So, two or three woodwind, four horns, 2-3 trumpets, trombones, tuba, tin plus 3, harp, standard things. In general, they won't really mind. It's usually appreciated. An orchestra manager will say, oh, great, the percussion and trombones will be really happy if you could let them go as early as possible, but do what you like. But if you're doing something like I don't know, I did something with the concert orchestra and we had a load of saxophones in and we had a synth player, and they wrote to me and said, look, would it be possible if we did this piece and this piece in the morning? Actually, what they first of all did was ask me for a schedule, and I sent a schedule, and then they wrote and said, actually, would it be all right if we did this piece and this piece, because the saxophone players are only in these two pieces and the synth player is only in these pieces. And of course that was in a way frustrating for me because there was a particular piece that I wanted to start with, because I felt that would be the easiest way for us to get started for those couple of days. But you just had to go, okay, fine, no problem. And I think what I asked to do was to switch two of the pieces around. So, it was almost largest, and then down to smallest.
Yeah. And thank you. And the other question I had was talking about, we were talking about balance, and that on the podium you can't really hear that much. I mean, would you then be listening in the auditorium while they're playing, or do you just trust them, or how do you know that things are being fixed? Or
I think a lot of it is, which is a sort of slightly annoying answer, but it's just experience. You get to, let's say you rehearse an orchestra in a rehearsal hall, and then you go to the concert hall, fine. You've got something to compare. You've got one constant, which was the orchestra, and you've got two different acoustics. So you're sort of assuming that more or less they're playing the same. And if you understand a little bit about the acoustic of the hall, you can say, okay, maybe I need to adjust this because maybe this won't carry so well. It's also worked if you know the hall, but the orchestra's never been there before. You can say, in this hall, we need to play very, very short because da da da. Yeah, I think in general, I feel as if over the years, I've got used to understanding what I hear on the podium and translating to have some kind of idea of what that would sound like in the hall. Sometimes, in fact, usually if the hall is very dry or it's very resonant or there are some weird things about it, there's the Chorhaus in Wiesbaden, on the ground floor, it's absolutely amazing. The sound for everybody is fantastic, but on the sort of first, second row up, something, there's a sort of VIP seats right in the centre looking down, and they get almost no strings and loads and loads and loads of wind and brass. So for them, a Mahler symphony is like for 80 minutes, whereas the people on the ground just get a really nice balanced thing. But of course, those people sometimes are the orchestra management and the sponsors, so you kind of have to be really careful. But generally, if there's a if there's a kind of peculiarity of the hall, the management or someone from the orchestra will come and tell you this. Oh, this hall's really bad for this and that, and you just bear that in mind. And as you get to know orchestras and get to know halls, you learn how to adjust for those things. But as I say, very often in a difficult acoustic, if the orchestra knows the hall, I will say to them, my impression is that we would struggle to hear the solo oboe, but I know that you know this hall much better than I do, so I'll trust you with it. And of course, what they do is then they all shut up and play really beautifully quietly. It's like the other oldest trick in the book, which is just my favourite one. If something doesn't quite work, and you know that the orchestra wasn't watching, they weren't paying attention, and that's why it didn't work. I just say, okay, let's go for letter G again. Let me try something different. And they'll go, oh, I was going to try something different. And you do exactly the same thing that you did the first time. But they're all watching, and hopefully they see it and they catch it, and then it's done. So much of this kind of guest conducting thing, it's a bit like how I imagine going on a blind date to be, it's really first impressions, and it's those first steps that then define how the relationship carries on. And if you can say negative things, as in this is wrong, this is bad, this isn't together, in a way that doesn't give anybody the blame, but just says, I think we could be more together here, or let's be even more beautiful, and if you do 7 or 8 or 10 of those, that probably gives you permission once in the project to say, that was absolutely disgusting, let's do that again, shall we? And then everybody laughs. But if you've just gone in and just been destructive and critical the whole time, then that's very, very difficult for people. I think one of the things that we forget is that our job is essentially to improve things, and you can do a lot of that by kind of, I suppose, positive reinforcement, by saying what's good and saying you'd like more of it. But really what we're actually doing is finding the things that are wrong, or the things that are not to our tastes, and correcting them. But although it sometimes can feel as if an orchestra is against you and deliberately trying to do the opposite of what you want to do, and very occasionally that happens, in reality, 99% of the time orchestras are trying desperately hard to please you, and they're all trying to make it as good as they can. And I think we always just need to remember that there's this sort of fundamental dichotomy, which is that our job is to say what's wrong, the people who are trying their hardest. And so anything that you can phrase in a really positive way goes down well. And but having said that, if you don't sort out the problems, people assume that you either can't hear them or that you don't know how to sort them out.
Yeah.
So finding that balance is the really critical thing. But you know, sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't.
Just if I can have one last little bit of a question. Do you ever, when you don't know a hall, do you ever research the hall? What difficulties there are? Do you try to go to concert or something?
Not really. No, honestly. As with the, you know, when I meet the orchestra for the first time, I'll ask if I can be driven to the hall early, and or make my way there early, and walk round and clap and check or whistle or sing or something. Listen to the players warming up in the hall. I mean, actually, that's a really good tip. Is in contrast to that first rehearsal where perhaps you don't want to be in the hall early, it's really, really useful to sit in the expensive seats in the hall on the concert day before the general rehearsal while the orchestra is warming up, because then you get a really good sense of actually how various things carry. And you usually hear the trumpet player trying to get dun, 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 dun. So you hear what that top end of the volume is likely to be like. You hear the very quiet, delicate oboe things, and then you can translate that, to relate to your first question, when you're standing on the podium. So
super. Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good to see you.
Hi Ben, I have a question.
Hi Kelly, go.
I wanted to ask you about a bit more detail about when an orchestra is playing really far behind the beat, whether this is usually just for the symphonic repertoire or whether they'll play with the stick for the concerto or for percussion-led things or contemporary music, or whether it's really across the board.
The slightly terrifying thing in my experience is that it's almost impossible to quantify or predict. So in general, the more German the orchestra, the later they will play. So German orchestras play quite late. Czech orchestras play quite close. Swiss orchestras play somewhere in the middle. British orchestras are generally pretty close to the beat. But sometimes, I found that BBC Concert Orchestra played quite late, much to my surprise, or what I perceived to be quite late. So much so that I was beating and it felt almost like they were kind of a quaver and eighth note out, which was a total a bit of a brain frazzle. But
would you ever ask them to play a bit closer to the stick?
My orchestra in Germany are generally quite good about it. The very first couple of projects that I did with them, I remember talking to Principal Flute once, and she said, "Yeah, it's funny for us because you conduct so far ahead," and I just sort of fell about laughing. I said, "Yeah, it's really funny for me because I feel as if you're playing so far behind." And she went, "Oh," and it sort of never occurred to her that this was a possibility. But of course now they know my every move. And they understand from my body language when I'm not entirely happy with, if something's grooving, if it's locked in, if I feel comfortable. And I have to change very, very little about my physicality to get them to kind of click into it. On the other hand, I'm also sort of enjoying sometimes just going bar and just letting them play when it feels nice. The one thing that we never ever agreed on was the last chord of Flying Dutchman Overture. Said, and I would go bam, and it would just come a crotchet late, and fine. And I said to them eventually, the last but one rehearsal, the rehearsal for the general rehearsal, I said, look, actually, you have to remember I'm British. This is getting a little bit scary for me. Could we just do it so that I give the beat and you just play a little bit closer? And they, yeah, of course. So damn, and I said, oh, great, it's like heaven. Thank you so much. And then in the concert, bang, and it came 3 times later than it had ever arrived in any of the rehearsals. But it was beautiful. And I mean, I just gave the one, And I waited, and Matthias, the leader, sort of went, shall we? And they all went, yes, let's. Bang. And there is an extent to which you can't really fight it. I mean, to refer to one of my earlier talks about conducting films, that is really the exception where you sort of have to insist that they just absolutely play with your beat, otherwise it doesn't work. Although having said that, there are still times when I would conduct ahead to get them the sound to speak in the right place. With concertos, it's slightly different. They will still play late, but they will listen. One of the things that I like is when an orchestra is playing softly enough and it's a concerto that they know, you know, the soloist says, and you can go, and give the one, I mean, not really early, but not, you don't have to go, it's not like with an amateur orchestra where you have to go there and get it in the right place. You can give it and they'll all go, and they'll just catch it. And I think being able to show them in your physicality, sometimes that one and sometimes just that one is important. If you just sort of invite them to play when it feels nice in relation to where they think they should play with the soloist, professional orchestras are really good about it. And just occasionally you can just show it's there, and they understand that as well. So I think it's, as long as you can communicate that urgency that you sometimes need, that this really is there, or actually, you know, we're a little bit out and it's here, it tends not to be a problem. But I remember the first time I experienced a delay like that, utterly terrifying. I was drenched in sweat within about 6 minutes. It felt like the worst. Felt like the worst thing ever. But you know, you just sort of get used to it gradually. So that's a rather unhelpful answer. Sorry. Who's next? Please keep them coming.
Hi Ben, I've got a question.
Hi Zach.
Yeah. Right. It's mainly about sort of programs that you're likely to get given or asked to do at the beginning of your career, whether they're Classic FM greatest hits type things or perhaps a popular program.
Sure.
How do you deal with perhaps an orchestra who don't really want to be there and have played Nimrod 6,000 times that year already, and you've got to keep the energy up and keep it moving and perhaps know what to skip over, what not to? How much control do you have over that, and sort of how do you approach the energy?
I mean, in terms of having the sort of influence over the program for those sorts of concerts at the beginning of one's career, that is, you know, pretty non-existent. Normally you get an email or a phone call, look, will you come and do this thing? It's the Hampton Court, we're playing 1812, there are fireworks, it's this and it's that. Maybe they'll say, you know, what do you think of the program? And I mean, you say, well, actually, you know, I'm slightly allergic to this piece, why don't we do the march from Damnation of Faust, because it's got 4 cornets in it and we've got them, you know, 4 trumpets, 2 trumpets, 2 cornets, and we've got them for the Tchaikovsky. And they say, great, that's good, let's do that, you know. It's, I mean, I suppose the short answer is just not to move the furniture around too much. I mean, it's the great thing, isn't it? You know, I mean, I very often have this sort of discussion with myself when I go to an orchestra, exactly this, and do something like, well, 1812 or the Blue Danube. So, I mean, let's take the Blue Danube. What do I call it? Carlos Kleiber Bingo. Yeah. Does he do that one? You know, does he slow down there? You know, da 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 da. Does he do the speed up there? Does he do the pullback? You know, all the sort of Carlos Kleiber things. And the orchestra is sitting there, and you get to those bits, and they're looking at you to see, does he do this one or not? Does he does? Okay, does that one? He does that one a little bit. But if you try and, if you just have one rehearsal and you've got time to play this piece 1.5 times or something, you won't have time to teach them an entirely new approach to a piece that they know very well and play lots. Even if you feel that you are right and they're wrong, or that, you know, you've had this incredible epiphany about how the Blue Danube should go, or you know, or Fledermaus, or, you know, that's the Fledermaus, sorry, that's what I was thinking of. Fledermaus. You sometimes just have to do things in the way that they are always done, or just to pick your battles. Basically, pick the few things that are really, really important to you, and sometimes you just let the orchestra play, because if you have very, very limited time and you try and unpick things that an orchestra knows and is used to playing in a certain way, you actually are getting in the way. And if you've got 12 or 13 or 14 other pieces to play, you can't do that with all of them. I suppose in terms of sort of, keeping the energy up, I wouldn't worry about it. They'll perform for you. They'll play their hearts out in a concert, because orchestras do. They might mess around a bit in the rehearsals. I mean, the one that always just drives me mad is the general pause in William Tell, and they all go and they all stamp their feet in the general pause bar. Oh, hilarious! Yeah, but they won't do it in the concert, or they shouldn't. And in a Tchaikovsky piano concerto or Rachmaninoff piano concerto, where all and they all go and do a sort of huge joke breath before the big downbeat. There are often lots of kind of orchestra gags, or it's even like if you say, right, tea, as in letter T, and they all go stand up as if to go for a cup of tea. All of those sort of things you just have to treat in good humour, and I don't think it's a good idea to try and enthuse them or to tell them how exciting or interesting this is. Just be efficient and be clear, and then they'll do their jobs, because they're professionals. Sorry, it's a bit of a dull answer, but don't move the furniture around, I think, is the answer. More questions, anyone?
Little question. I was just a little bit surprised by what you said about going for as long as you can before you start rehearsing, because just because I've heard a few people say that they take exactly the opposite approach. So I'm wondering, do you see any benefits of it the other way, or do you think that there are other circumstances where that will be more appropriate?
Such a good question. If you have, it really depends entirely on the sort of music that you're playing, and how much time you have. So if you're conducting a film and you've got 3 hours and each bit is 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and you're rehearsing each cue, you play the cue, you rehearse it, you move on. So you might only play for a minute before you say something and start rehearsing them. If it's a Rachmaninoff symphony or a Mahler symphony and you've got 3 days, you have to remember that usually an orchestra will have played this piece within 12 months or within 18 months. They will have played it undoubtedly more times than you've conducted it. An orchestra represents thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of practice and thousands of performances. And that first rehearsal is essentially their way of trying to get a feel for the sort of thing that you're going to bring to it. And I mean, yeah, Roger Knighton, whom I love dearly, assisted in lots, one of my absolute great idols, usually just such an amazing person to watch working, because he's kind of instinctive and he's fun. But once I remember doing a project with him where I was assisting him with Zurich Chamber Orchestra, and it was Handel water music, and it's this down, da-da-da-dum, da-da, kind of thing at the beginning, and he played 2 bars and then he stopped. And I just saw the orchestra who'd been all, Handel, great, and they all just went like this. And he started telling them, this, and leave this one late and make sure, and that one should be a semiquaver, all this kind of thing. And of course, what would have happened is that, because they're amazing, is that the first time would have been a bit chaotic, but you know, those first 8 bars, whatever they are, repeat, and the second time it would have been much better, and then the third time it would have been ready for some polishing. But the first time, you know, he didn't even let them get to the end of the phrase, and he started, you know, telling them what to do, and they're all sitting there going, "I know what to do. Just give us a chance." That is, I mean, that is the other thing, is that if you don't know the orchestra, how do you know how quickly they'll improve? You know, an orchestra that you know very well, sometimes it's possible to get to that step of rehearsing efficiently and quickly earlier. But if I'm meeting an orchestra for the first time, I want to find out how they sound. I want to find out how they look at each other, how, if they look at me, if they're engaging with what I'm showing or trying to show them. I mean, let's imagine there's an exposition repeat and something's not quite worked the first time. Are they all kind of listening out to try and correct the thing that didn't quite work the first time? Or do they just play it the same way and let the mistake happen a second time? You know, I was always taught that you should never dare to say anything to an orchestra that you hadn't tried to show them at least 3 times. And of course, that's not always possible, but I think it's a quite good standard to try and hold yourself to. Because if you can correct things just by gesture and facial expression, and actually, well, this is that, and you know, these should be long or whatever it is, or you know, rather than stopping and saying you should be long, you know, an orchestra will appreciate that because you're not wasting their time, or at least you're using their time productively. But if you don't give them a chance to show you what they can do and to show you what they themselves can correct without your input, you're kind of cutting their legs off out from under them. That's my impression. I think also, I find that you can build connections with individual players and with the orchestra as a whole much more quickly making music than you can through words, especially if the language thing is an issue. I mean, I spent 2 days in Prague. Actually, no, I spent 2 days in Prague rehearsing, and then probably it was concert 3 or 4 of a sort of 10 concert tour. Actually, it was slightly more than that. It was a lot of concerts with the Czech National Symphony Orchestra. And, you know, we were doing Raiders of the Lost Ark and Jaws, and then some classical concerts. And, you know, you'd sort of rehearse, and sometimes you'd say something and someone would say, I didn't quite understand, and someone would translate. And anyway, halfway through the tour or something, one of my friends in the orchestra said, you do know that the trombones don't have a single idea of any word that you say to them. They just nod and then just play it the same. And I went, oh, okay. Because I've been saying to the trombones, oh, trombones, you know, 328. And they'd go, and you say, 328, could this be short, you know, staccato? And they go, but they've no idea where 328 is. They didn't bother to ask anyone, so they just nod. And actually, so all I could do, and especially that was really helpful once I knew that, was that I had to actually show them. I had to rehearse them by conducting all the things that I wanted. So actually stopping and talking to them had been entirely pointless, and presumably to the great hilarity of the rest of the orchestra. But anyway, but as I say, it really depends on the amount of time you have and what sort of music it is. If it's a contemporary piece and it's just complete chaos, there's no point bashing through something if it's not helping the orchestra to, you know, get that feeling of how the music locks together. If the piece is so difficult that it needs to be taken apart so you can build it up so the orchestra can get that sense of how it all glues together, then of course you have to start rehearsing earlier. So you just have to judge it based on the situation.
Can I just support you, Ben, with that very much by saying, emphasising, particularly if you don't know the orchestra, keep conducting for as long as possible. If it's an orchestra that you work with regularly, then it is possibly legitimate to stop after the first phrase. If they know you and you know them, and they know the sort of thing you're going to say, you're in a completely different relationship. But
Agreed.
if it's an orchestra you don't know, they want to see that you can conduct, not that you can talk. And I've been in situations both as a conductor and as a player where the conductor has, where either I've blown it or the conductor's blown it by saying something that's perfectly obvious, which if you only just shut up and let us sort it out and give us a chance, he could save himself and the rest of us so much stress. And if after 3 bars you want to throw something at the conductor because he's not giving you a chance to sort it, then there are problems all around, and it's very difficult to retrieve that kind of situation.
Yeah, thank you, John. I completely agree. I mean, I'll try and find the link for you guys somewhere and post it in the group. There's an amazing clip, I think, of Henry Wood saying something about the problem with the young conductor is that he wants to educate the orchestra. He conducts a few bars and then he stops.
It's Beecham.
It's Beecham. And he says, and he starts to educate. When I start to rehearse a piece, play the whole piece through from beginning to end, whole blessed piece. The orchestra makes a few mistakes. I then play the whole piece through once again. The orchestra makes no mistakes. I then rehearse a few small spots and I'm ready for the concert. And that is why I can make do with 2 rehearsals and the young conductor needs 4. And yeah, fine. But that is essentially true. Professional orchestras will correct 8 out of 10 of their own, they'll sort out their own stuff. And what's really nice is that, sometimes you'll hear something's not quite together or something doesn't quite agree, and you'll see the cellos talking to the basses, we're going to do down, up, and then it may not be corrected to your liking, but they're at least offering you something that's unified. But if you don't give them a chance to make those corrections themselves and to talk to each other and to help themselves, it's like you're saying that you don't trust them. So I think conducting for as long as possible is a good plan. And it's better to remain silent and appear stupid than open your mouth and remove all doubt. I've definitely said a few first things in rehearsals that I've sort of slightly regretted and God, you idiot, why do you say that? Anyone else?
Yeah, Ben, I have a whole bunch of answers.
Hi, Yuri. Hi.
Hello. I would jump in. Yeah. Well, just to catch up on this playing through and stopping. What if the orchestra is used with, that the GMD got them used that he stops after every 5 measures? This is my question 1. And question 2 is really when we are getting to a difficult situation, 2 kinds of situation. You're coming to the orchestra and you get to realize there is a conflict between some people there. So it doesn't have to do anything with you. Or if you feel someone is picking on you, someone is testing you, just some. So yeah, how do you manage that? How do you stay just?
I've definitely had it in the first 5 minutes of rehearsal that the third horn says, "I'm so sorry. Could you just explain to me? I've got a printed A flat, but it doesn't sound quite right. Could you just tell me what the chord is, please?"
Well, this is the next.
And you look down, and it's a B flat minor chord, and it's horn in D, and your brain's just going, and the only thing you can do is just take a second. You look, you say it's this, it should be that, and it's either the note's correct, but actually it's a 7th, so it probably feels a bit funny, or and you just have to deal with it. The internal politics of the orchestra one is really, really difficult because sometimes you will also just try and solve a situation. You'll be presented with a problem and you think it's you, and then actually in the break someone will say, look, that the principal trombone hates whoever it is because they can never agree on tuning.
Well, it's working the strings, when the principal viola hates the principal violin. This is what
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I've had situations where I know that the principal bass and the principal cello hated each other, and actually it's quite helpful because you can, if you find out what the issue is, someone tells you in a break, I could say to the cellos, would you mind just letting the basses lead those pizzas, just sit back a little bit, play a little bit softer, let the basses play a little bit earlier, a little bit louder than you, just let yourself be kind of wrapped into the sound. And I looked at the principal bass, and the principal bass was going at me. And you go, okay, cool. But I only knew that because the viola player or the leader had told me, oh, the principal bass hates this and whatever. And over time, actually, if you find out some of the stuff that's going on, you can actually kind of help repair some of those relationships a little bit. But it's very, very difficult not to think that it's you, because our default perspective is to imagine that, it's our problem. So I've forgotten what the first bit of your question was, Yuri.
The first one was about when the orchestra is used by the GMD that they stop.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, in which case I'd play for an hour without stopping. I think if your natural style is close to what the music director does, then you should go and do that. But if your natural style is very different from what the music director does, then go and do that. And if it's something in between, it doesn't matter. Just do what comes naturally to you, because doing anything else will be felt by the orchestra to be insincere. And if you do what you do honestly, they will at least respond to it honestly. They might dislike it, but they'll respect you for being yourself. I think the real danger is to go in and say, I know that this orchestra likes to play this music in a certain way, or I know that this orchestra is used to that, and so therefore I will not implement my ideas. I realize this is slightly in conflict to what Jack was asking about, what you do if you've only got, no time and you've got to rehearse this piece, but if you have time, you should feel brave enough to present your own ideas if you have time to work them through with the orchestra and help them understand what you're trying to show them.
Exactly. It was my original plan, and then I started playing through, and it was the third page of the score, and the violists, they like fair playing violists. I mean, because they are always in between, so they suffer from both from the bass and the melody. So he says, "Okay, could we just repeat this, please?" He just waves with his bow, like, "Stop! It's too much. We are already overburned with so much music. It's 3 pages already. And can we just?" And they start, they want to control you and just that you do.
That's interesting. I have to say I've never experienced that, and I probably just wouldn't stop. It's terribly rude, but I probably just wouldn't stop.
Okay.
It's really, really interesting. There are, I've had orchestra managers come up to me and say, "It's really strange. There's no talking in your rehearsal. What did you say?" And I said, "I didn't say anything." And he said, but it's normally a really chatty orchestra." And I say, "Well, I just sort of don't allow them to chat somehow because I expect them not to be chatting." And a lot of that, I suppose, sort of, discipline, leadership stuff, it's very, very personal, but there are certainly occasional attempts by orchestras to assert themselves over you early on and to show you that they are in charge. And actually how you respond to that, how you deal with it.
How?
If you lose your temper, it's game over. But if you can deflect it or turn it to your advantage, or actually say, "Do you know what? I'd really, really just love to do it like this. Could we do this? Is that all right?" Then they'll usually go, "Yeah, that's fine, thanks." That's in my experience. But
can I just say something, Ben? There is a tendency, particularly with young, inexperienced conductors, and particularly conductors who an orchestra hasn't seen before, particularly on the continent, for people to try and put you on the spot just to see how you react.
totally.
I was right at the beginning of my career, I had to do a ballet Carla in Germany, and we had a set of parts. They were the only set of parts. They were a clean set of parts, but of this particular piece. And the leader of the second violins, who was about to retire, complained about, quote, "this unreadable shit." And I looked straight back at him because I knew this was the only set of parts of this thing because it was a John Lansbury arrangement. And I said, "Look, they play the complete piece in London and Vienna and Rome from this material, it should be possible to play 8 minutes of this unreadable shit here. And because I said it, that was the end of it. He just wanted to see if I could flick it back, and we got on with it.
Yeah, totally. It's and I mean, you know, I've had questions from someone in the orchestra, and you know, they've said, you know, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this phrasing? And I said, oh, well, because it's, you know, appears this later. And you know, I said, does that help? And he said, not really, and sits down. And you know, there's nothing you can say to that. But it's you just have to be very, very, very thick-skinned. And again, it's always, yeah. You have to remember that for the most part they're trying to do their best, and if anybody in an orchestra asks a question to the conductor, you have to imagine what bravery it takes for them to do that, how brave they have to be to actually ask a question in front of 30, 50, 70, 90, 100 of their colleagues and you, and always try and treat it with respect, even if it's a really shitty question. Because often it's not meant as a shitty question, but it just comes over that way. But when those moments happen, you can suddenly see the orchestra on a knife edge going, oh, how's the conductor going to deal with this? And if you deal with it well, they kind of will give you the benefit of the doubt and they'll support you. And if you deal with it poorly, then that might be it. But that's a good one.
How do you develop this reaction? This is the thing, you know, like that you calm.
Oh, I mean, I've said some really bad things in my time. You know, there is a phrase to a bass player that I once said that I'll just never forgive myself for. I mean, you know, I was sort of chamber orchestra thing. We were rehearsing a Mozart piano concerto, and I asked him to play a bit louder. I said, you know, really a bit louder. We did it again. And I said, you know, really, could you play quite a lot louder, please? And still nothing happened. And then I said, you know, I mean, really, you know, and then he went, you know, and sort of completely just ripped his instrument in half. And I said something like, oh God, you know, don't need to be a dick about it. And you just went, oh God, I didn't say, and you can just never take those words back. And I mean, actually it was with an amateur group. It wasn't with a professional orchestra, thank goodness. But, you know, it is still remembered by the people who were there as the moment where Ben called the bass player a dick. You just kind of go, oh. And you know, I mean, it was 10 years ago. It was sort of I was very inexperienced, and I regret it. But I think of it often, and I have learned in those situations to go, don't call anyone a dick, and you know, you just gradually learn. And I think also just this thing to bear in mind that that in general, even if a question comes across as being very challenging, it's usually meant in a way that's productive to get the orchestra to the next stage, in my experience. I can't remember, was Toby saying something in there? It's got to race to a ferry.
Oh, while I'm still here, in which case,
you're still here.
Let me just jump in and say how a huge thank you, Ben. This is just what I've heard is just amazing. I'm really looking forward to listening back to the recording. And I'm just so relieved to see that Zoom worked without there being an official host. So it's great. And seeing all the comments makes me realize what a great session this has been. So maybe while I'm here, I can lead a round of applause for you. So thank you so much, Ben. Absolutely amazing.
Thank you, everyone. Really nice talking to you. Thank you.
I did notice there's a question, but Andre still has his hand raised. Were you waiting for a question, Andre?
No, sorry, I've already asked my question. Thank you very much.
Is there anyone else who wants to ask anything at all?
Can I ask you something really quick, and maybe you can answer it another time if you need to go?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
About working with university orchestras,
yeah.
Because you came and conducted me back at the University of Birmingham,
yeah,
a long time ago. And how did you approach that? How did you come about getting that work? And did that?
Quite badly from what I remember. I remember I was quite bad-tempered and. Yeah, no, I mean, I mean, I think because I just to explain to everybody, I studied at Birmingham University, so it was sort of going back to going back as a guest conductor, as a sort of grown up guest conductor. So that's sort of how it came about, by chatting to the people who run the department. But I mean, that was quite a weird feeling for me, because I suppose it was what, 2011, something like that. 2010, 11, 12, something like that. So it was probably 7, 7 years or so since I'd left as a postgrad. So it wasn't that far, wasn't that long since I'd been there. And actually, I found it quite a challenging. I found it quite a challenging thing. I'd sort of quite like to do it again now, with all the things that I've been telling you guys borne in mind, because you know that's the thing, isn't it? Is that it's very, very easy to go and do a concert and afterwards go, oh, I should have done that, and this I didn't do very well, and you know, and that's sort of how, you know, what Yuri was asking, that's basically how you learn, is by doing it badly. And regretting your poor life choices. But yeah, I mean, maybe send me a message, Jack. But, any more, or is that we fine? In which case, I guess I'll just say a huge thank you to you all. It's been really, really fun talking to you. Thanks for the lovely, lovely questions and so on.
Thank you.
Well, no, it's a real pleasure, and have lovely days, and see you guys all soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah,
See you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Ben.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.